مشاهدينا مرحبا بكم في حوارات السياق. قالت جنوب إفريقيا إن خفض الاعتماد على الدولار الأمريكي يتصدر أجندة أعمال قمة زعماء دول بريكس. عموما للمزيد حول هذا الملف ينضم إلينا جوستافو دي كارفالو، وهو باحث أول في معهد جنوب إفريقيا للشؤون الدولية. أستاذ جوستافو، مرحبا بك معنا.
Thank you very much.
ما الذي حققته مجموعة البريكس منذ أن بدأت الاجتماع لأول مرة؟
I think the BRICS has been a very important moment for developing countries since 2009 to really try to identify a new voice for developing countries. We know that there's 5 countries now. At the time when it was created in 2009, South Africa wasn't a member. But since then, they don't have a lot of things in common. They come from different regions, they have different sizes. But the one thing that brings them together is the fact that they believe that the international order is unjust, that their voice is not being particularly heard in many multilateral institutions, and what they would like to do is not necessarily to change the global order, but rather to identify that the global order is already changing, and these countries are much more powerful than they were in the past. So therefore, they would like to have a much more impactful role in international relations. And I think now in South Africa in 2023 is a particularly important moment, because not only these 5 countries that compose BRICS right now are claiming those issues, but we have a very large number of countries from the whole of the global south also aiming to join BRICS. We have countries from Africa like Egypt or Algeria, Senegal, and Nigeria. We have countries in Latin America like Venezuela, countries in Asia like Indonesia, and even countries like in the Middle East. We know that countries like the UAE have joined the New Development Bank, and I think it's particularly important that there is a representation of different members from the Middle East in particular, and I think it does have a very good opportunity for developing nations to be more impactful in global politics.
إذن هل تعتقد أن بريكس تهدد الهيمنة الاقتصادية الغربية؟
I don't think it's necessarily a threat to Western economic domination, but rather that developing countries are claiming their own space. Of course, we do. The West and Western economies remain incredibly important in global politics. But when we see that BRICS countries are already larger in GDP than the G7, it does show that the inability of these countries to really influence decision-making in organizations like the World Bank or the IMF, it creates imbalanced responses that are it's seen as unfair by many of these members. So, of course, there is a number of issues being discussed at the moment within BRICS. There's the issue of expansion. One important development is the issue of currencies, where a number of countries from BRICS and outside of BRICS are at the moment looking into trade with their own currencies and looking for alternatives, not necessarily to replace the US dollar. I think there is a consensus amongst economists that it would be really hard to replace the US dollar in the near future, but thus just reducing the risks of being over-reliant on one currency. And we've seen the effects that it has created in many countries in the global south in terms of the inability of access funds, or even one we see in a country like Russia, where the sanctions froze a lot of their assets internationally.
بما أنك أثرت نقطة توسعة بريكس، لماذا لم ينضم أي عضو جديد منذ سنوات؟
I think it's important to remember that the discussions we're having now in 2023 is the second discussion around expansion within BRICS. The first one was in 2010 when South Africa was invited to join and eventually joined in 2011. What we see right now is that within BRICS members, there are a lot of questions regarding what will be the future of BRICS and what is the implications of such an expansion. So we see, for instance, countries like Russia and China are very keen for that expansion to happen. South Africa is positive about that and is supportive of the idea, but focusing particularly on the importance of African countries to join. Then we have India and Brazil. India stated officially this morning here in Johannesburg that they are in favor of the expansion. We do know they have certain concerns about dilution of particular their own visibility, and especially with some concerns around Chinese influence within BRICS. And the new development has been with Brazil, that and for various months it was a country that showed to be somehow in favor of an expansion, focusing at the time particularly in Argentina, that it's now not applying anymore, a lot to do with their own domestic dynamics. But at this stage, Brazil feels largely that it's it can lose this position of being part of an exclusive group, and that lack of exclusivity may limit its own influence within the group. So what is going to happen in the next couple of days, I don't think is necessarily a definition of which countries are going to be joining. We may be surprised and see one or two countries joining, but I think what we are really going to be seeing and hoping to be seeing to a certain degree is the definition of a process. What are the categories of countries that should be applying for BRICS? What are the criteria? And particularly what is going to happen with decision-making processes within BRICS, noting that it's a group that is very informal in nature, and having more countries would complicate quite a lot the dynamics. So if member states currently don't have clarity around what does it mean for that expansion for the future, it could be a complicated issue. And I think this is largely what it's taking so long for members to make a decision on that.
بخصوص دعوة الدول الإفريقية، هل هي أجندة جنوب إفريقيا؟
This is a very important question. And I think when we look into the way in which BRICS is managed on an annual basis, there is a lot of responsibilities that are in the hands of the host. So in that sense, South Africa has the authority of inviting a number of countries. It is important to say that it's not the first time that non-BRICS members are coming to the summit. There has already been for a number of years a structure called BRICS Plus, in which a number of non-BRICS members join BRICS countries. But for South Africa, there was a particular reason for why it invited so many countries. And despite when we look into those 60-something countries that were invited, we need to remember that the overall theme of the summit this year, it is about an integration between BRICS and African countries. And when it comes to South African foreign policy, where we are in the middle of the implementation of a continental free trade area, and this is one of the major foreign policy priorities within the country, it does seem for the country to be important to invite them. The invitation does not necessarily mean that all of these countries will be or are interested in applying for BRICS. What we know, for instance, in the African continent, we have around 4 countries that have expressed their interest in joining, namely Ethiopia, Egypt, Algeria, Nigeria, and Senegal. Maybe not 4, a bit more than that, but it's a handful of countries that have applied, that have showed that interest to join, and it's a fairly common process within South African foreign policy. We know in a lot of the international meetings that South Africa organizes, there is a tendency of inviting African member states, but I think the important aspect, if we look even within or outside of the continent, what are the key countries that are interested in? They're all developing economies. They're middle-income countries. Some of them, not all of them, some of them are income countries, but they're all large economies and very important countries in their own region. And in that regard, whether they join BRICS or not, I think is still a very important conversation to have, especially when we are in such a divisive international environment. And providing that space, I think it can provide BRICS an important opportunity for success in the future, noting that it's not an easy process and there is nothing guaranteed that BRICS will change the global order or to be able to achieve all of its objectives. But it's certainly important to create dialogue with other global South countries, especially in the middle of an expansion like that.
أود أن نعود إلى نقطة ذكرتها سابقا حول مواصفات الدول المؤهلة للانضمام لبريكس. هل لك أن تشرح الأمر أكثر؟
Absolutely. So we had some drama this year, and it was quite an interesting drama when President Emmanuel Macron from France asked to attend BRICS and eventually wasn't invited. This brought to the core to a lot of BRICS members of what is the thing that brings BRICS members together, noting that their diversity, they don't really agree on everything. And it's and as a matter of fact, BRICS has been fairly narrow in terms of the areas of engagements that they do. So what we're noticing now is that more and more looking into specific when we're talking about criteria is to understand what are the prerequisites that we would like to see countries having. Is there a particular size of the economy that we would like to see? Is there a particular dynamics within their own regions that we would like to see? So all of those issues are quite important right now. And if we remember in 2011, when South Africa joined BRICS, there was, even within BRICS, there was a lot of questions about why South Africa. South Africa is much smaller than any of the other BRICS members. If we compare South Africa to the Brazilian economy, that would be the 4th largest economy within BRICS. It's already 5 to 6 times larger than the South African one. So this is not a new conversation, but it certainly has been reinvigorated in the last year in particular, since these discussions started taking further shape, to identify how do we make sure that the new countries that come are actually having the same objectives, but also can contribute to objectives of the group.
تغير كبير حدث في هندسة النظام العالمي، ومع ذلك لم يستطع بوتين حضور القمة. هل نجحت الولايات المتحدة والأوروبيين في البروباغندا الإعلامية حول قمة بريكس؟
I'm not so sure that it was necessarily just because of the Western pressure to South Africa. They definitely played a role in terms of how South Africa eventually decided, together with Russia, that Vladimir Putin wouldn't be coming. But we need to understand that South Africa is a signatory of the Rome Statute, and by domestic law, it would have been compelled to do so. Noting that in 2015, when President al-Bashir came to South Africa and South Africa refused to arrest him, there was a major internal crisis about that, and a legal crisis that involved the Supreme Court of Appeals and a number of back and forth in terms of the government and our judiciary. The main fear for us is that because to a large degree, the issue around the ICC and Vladimir Putin largely became a domestic issue in South Africa, in a space where the government was heavily criticized, looking for elections in 2024. Certainly there was the pressure of the Western media, but I think largely had far more to do with the inability of South Africa to host him, rather than the success of Western counterparts in terms of the pressure they made.
المحادثات في هذه القمة ستتمحور حول تحفيز الاستثمارات في القارة السمراء. ما الضامن لتنفيذ تلك الالتزامات؟
There's definitely no guarantee that the pledges that were made will actually be implemented. And I think it's a very important point for us to reflect, considering that we have these types of summits in the continent happening on a very frequent basis. We're just coming out of a Russia-Africa summit, we had a US-Africa summit, and of course, now we have the BRICS summits with a very strong undertone about Africa. What it is interesting, and what I'm starting to look into some of those discussions, is how African countries themselves are looking for entry points, especially within the context of the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area, and also other discussions happening within BRICS. Also, noting that many of the BRICS members bilaterally are very important investors and traders with the continent. China has been for already 10 years the largest bilateral partner with African countries. India is already the second largest bilateral partner with Africa already for some time. And even countries like South Africa and Brazil are very high in the scale. And I'm using South Africa in the sense that South Africa is part of the African continent, but how South Africa trades and invests with the rest of the continent, all of them have their own relevance in terms of trade and investments in Africa. And I think it does provide a good opportunity because it moves beyond just a bilateral relationship, let's say, that we have between South Africa and China, and moves much more to a better mechanisms that could potentially, and I think that potentially is the operative word here, that there's no guarantee once again, but it could potentially create a system that different groupings, different mechanisms that exist internationally can start complementing one another much more. And I think this is the expectation for many within the continent, but noting that development and there is still an agency and there's still a continental responsibility towards its own future. It shouldn't be just the expectation that outsiders would provide that, but certainly it becomes a very interesting part of the conversation and different sides of the conversation in reality.
آخر سؤال لي هو حول الدول العربية مثل مصر والجزائر، حيث تحظوهما حماسة كبيرة للانضمام. ما الذي يمكن أن يقدم لهما؟
I think the disappointment of countries that may not see them being included at BRICS right now could very well be managed, depending on what types of justifications and explanations will be presented. Noting that even the formal applications that we've seen from some of the countries, including Algeria, to join BRICS were done without any particular kind of guidance. And this goes back to the idea of the criteria in terms of what are countries required to do. I think it would be very important for BRICS members when they decide about the expansion. It seems that we're going to see some kind of expansion in one way or another, even if the countries are not appointed or defined now, but to provide that longer term explanation of what is expected of countries that are joined BRICS and how does it bridge and link with the views and objectives of the group as a whole? So it could be a bit of disappointment in some of these countries, but I do hope, and this is much more on a hope than my actual prediction of what is going to happen, is that countries, BRICS members will be able to provide a good explanation and a clear explanation in terms of what the process would look like.
أستاذ جوستافو دي كارفالو، شكرا جزيلا لك للمشاركة معنا في حوارات السياق.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate that.
مشاهدينا، شكرا على طيب المتابعة. إلى الملتقى.